Hello everyone and welcome back to the Lingua Loom. Today we're going to start the first episode of the Tracing the Critic series, which is Phase 1, Classical Foundation. The episode is Plato, why did he distrust poetry? So the founding historical gesture of Western literary criticism, we're going to start with this, that why Plato distrusts poetry. So before starting the video, please do like, subscribe and share and do comment as they mean quite a lot for us. So the critic is Plato and primary text is Republic. We're going to discuss his key concept, mimesis and theory of forms. So let's start the topic. First our section 1 is Athens, poetry and the stakes. To understand Plato's distrust of poetry, we must first grasp what poetry was in classical Athens. While poetry held a very important position at that time, it was not a minority private pursuit, as the classical scholar Eric Havelock demonstrated in Preface to Plato, written in 1963. Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, functioned as the primary vehicle of paedia, the moral and civic and practical education of Greek citizens. Homer was not read, he was performed, memorized, and internalized. He was, in Plato's own formulation, at Republic, the educator of Greece. So that's what he called Homer. So this is a pressure point. Plato's critique of poetry is not a static quibble about poetic quality. It is a philosophical challenge to the authority of the entire Homeric tradition, which is Homer's tradition, as a source of knowledge, moral guidance, and civic formation. When Plato proposes to scrutinize and ultimately restrict the poets, he is engaged in the contest for cultural authority between philosophy and poetry. A context he famously names as the ancient choir. So this is what Plato believes, that there is an ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry. So Plato's critique is spread across three primary texts. First, the Republic, book 2nd and 3rd, the Republic, book number 10, and the dialogue, Iron. So this one, and the Phaedrus introduces the more nuanced concept of divine madness. These texts do not exactly say the same thing. The crucial point we return to is the paradox section. So let's start. So let's move to understanding mimesis, which is the Greek term mimesis, is translated as imitation or representation, but the translation is imperfect because no language words can exactly be translated in another word. This is a well-accepted concept. So in the Republic, Plato deploys the concept across different registers, sometimes meaning theatrical impersonation, which is in book 3, sometimes ontological representation. So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Plato's rhetoric and poetry notes that book 3 treats mimesis as impersonation, taking on a character's voice, while the book 10 recasts it in metaphysical terms using the theory of forms. So mimesis, let's look at the term. In Plato's book 10 Argument, Mimesis describes the relationship of an artwork to reality. The artwork imitates a particular physical object which itself imitates the eternal form. The artwork is therefore an imitation of an imitation. Well, this is quite a lot important line to remember, as this is what Plato said, that art is imitation of an imitation. That this world is not real, so it is imitation, which is in simple a copy of a copy. So to remove from truth, producing in a viewer an illusion of knowledge rather than knowledge itself. So the three-level hierarchy from the Republic, let's look at this. So Plato illustration his argument using the example of bad. So let's look at these three levels. The first one, the highest level, is the form of bad. The eternal, unchanging, perfect idea of bad created by God exists in the realm of true being. This is the only genuine reality philosopher alone can access it through reason. So then level 2, particular object, the craftsman bad, the bad made by carpenter, a particular physical object that participates in the form but not in the form itself. It can decay, vary, be different in different places, one removed from truth. Then the painter's or poet's bad, the image of the bad in the painting or poem, an imitation of particular object which is already only an imperfect copy of form. Two removes from truth. Plato argues this produces not knowledge but a convincing illusion of knowledge. So this is what I'm talking about as which is the imitation of imitation, which is the real world exists in somewhere else, which Plato said, and we are living in a copy of that world, and when we write about that something or talk about it, then we're copying that copy. So it is imitation of imitation. So the three-level ontology is a metaphysical engine of Plato's epistemological charge against poetry. The poet is like a painter who depicts a bird from a single angle, not knowing what the bird truly is, its form, not knowing how to make one, but able to produce a convincing appearance that deceives those who mistake the image for the reality. So the poet, Plato argues, can make everything generals, doctors, craftsmen without actually knowing any of these crafts. This is not a minor failure, it is structural defect in poet's relationship to truth. So this is Plato's claim that a poet can make everything through its imagination without knowing the work of doctor or craftsman or anyone else. So, section 3, which is Plato's three charges against poetry. Well, he was against poetry, but not all sorts of poetry. So, first his charge, poetry is twice removed from the truth. So, this is what he believed. Let's look at it. That poetry is twice removed from the truth as So the poet imitates appearance, not reality, since the physical world itself is a copy of the eternal form. The poem is a copy of copy, a shadow of shadow. So in Republic, Plato argues that because imitative poetry represents particular sensory objects rather than the form, that they are their true originals. It operates at the third level of ontological remove from general being. The poet, like a mirror holder who walks around and produces reflection of the object, produces images rather than knowledge. So crucially, Plato distinguishes the poet from a craftsman. A craftsman makes a bed by understanding its function. A poet merely depicts the bed's appearance. So this is what I say that poetry is something that is not real. So poetry, the second charge, poetry corrupts the character and soul. So he said the Homeric epics portray the gods as immoral, petty, and deceitful. They model weakness and emotional excess. For the guardian of ideality, such imitation is psychologically dangerous. So this is what he said, that Plato does not ban poetry here. He permits imitation of virtuous characters in praise of God and nobleman. The ban is especially on poetry that models moral disorder. So he said that moral disorder, that is a kind of corrupt poetry. Well, if you portray good characters, then it is good. Then third charge is poetry represents the god. Homer shows God lying, cheating, and behaving shamefully. For Plato, God is a definition of good and unchanging. Poetry that depicts otherwise spread false theology which is politically dangerous in the ideal city. Well, the Greeks used to believe in gods very much. That's why they have a lot of gods like Zeus, Horus, and many much more. So they really appreciated and praised God. So he said that if you're going to treat gods as someone lying and cheating, that is very shameful. They should be praised and appreciated, not should be shamed. So he said that God is the cause only of good, not of evil. God does not change form or deceive mortals. Both principles are violated through Homer and Hesiod. Zeus sending the deceptive dreams like in Iliad and rivalries and these kind of fights. He said that this is not how gods should be represented. Then Ion, which part 4, section 4, poetry as divine madness. So let's look at it. What the Ion argues. The Ion is a short Socratic dialogue in which Socrates interrogates Ion, a rhapsode, professional reciter of Homer, who claims supreme understanding of Homer's poem. Socrates quickly demonstrates that Ion cannot explain why his expertise covers Homer but not other poets who treat the same themes. If Ion's talent were genuine tech, it would transfer across poet. It does not. Therefore, it is not knowledge. So he said that knowing about Homer's work is not true knowledge. What is it then? Socrates answers it in a rhetorical style that poet is divinely inspired, having a god within. That is what he said, that poets have a god within. The muse removes the poet's own mind and uses a poet as an instrument the way musicians use a lyre. So the poet is not a craftsman but a puzzle. The muse first makes man inspired, and then through these inspired one share the enthusiasm, and chain is formed like a iron rings that hangs in a row from magnetic stone. The muse is the magnet, poet is the first ring, and rhapsode is the next, and the audience is the last. So that's how that he said that starts from muse reaching till poet and then rhapsode, and then rhapsode is having a god within, like his ability, his capabilities, which means to inspire other, and then it reaches the audience, which is the last stage. So critical implication, divine inspiration for Plato is not compliment. If a poet speaks by divine possession rather than rational understanding, then a poet cannot teach, cannot explain, cannot be questioned. The poet knows nothing. The god speaks through the poet. Well, that is the claim that is said, that it is not the poet that is something spectacular, it is the ability within him that is God inside him, which speaks through him, just as our oracles do. This is flattery and demotion. Poetry is elevated as a divine instrument, stripped of any cognitive authority. So this is the whole crux of that statement, that God take away the mind of poets and use them as his ministers, as he also uses diviners and holy prophets, in order that we who hear them may know them to be speaking not of themselves, who utter these precise, precious words in the state of unconsciousness, but that God himself is the speaker. That's what Plato mentioned in his work. Then let's look at case explore Plato's argument in action. So we'll look at what he charged applied to specific tests. First, Homer's and the Iliad, the primary target. So let's look at Homer, the primary target. So Homer is Plato's primary target. Through the Republic, Plato identifies the praiser of Homer, who say that this poet educated Greece, as the position he is arguing against. He agrees that Homer is the educator of Greece, but argues he makes Homer more dangerous, not less. Specific Homer passages Plato objects to. First one is Achilles weeping and lamenting in Iliad. So Then Zeus sending the deceptive dream. This violates theological principle that God does not deceive. Then the gods laughing at Olympian feast. This speaks that gods are undignified. So Plato's critique is not that Homer is a bad poet, he openly acknowledges Homer's greatness. His argument is that Homer's power makes false representation more dangerous than a mediocre poet would be. He said that gods should be respected, not disrespected, as Homer did by presenting God in his work. Then tragedy and emotion, let's look at this one. Okay. Then Plato's sharpest argument against tragedy concerned the soul's tripartite structure. He argues that a rational soul governs the spirited and appetitive parts. Tragedy, by engineering pity, fear, lamentation in the audience, exercise and strengthen precisely those parts of the soul that reason should govern. So the argument is even a good man, Plato says, when watching tragedy allows himself emotion he would suppress in real life. So reason is temporarily suspended, the emotional muscles grow stronger through use and habitual emotional responsive then bleed back into real life, weakening rational self-governance. This is different from merely saying tragedy makes people cry. Plato is making psychological arguments about habit formation, repeated practice of emotional response, even in fiction, trains us to respond emotionally rather than rationally to life situations. So this is what he said, that poetry makes us emotional. Now let's look at it by applying it to Urdu. So for better understanding, the Urdu ghazal tradition in poets like Mir Taqi Mir, Ghalib and Faz Ahmad Faz present a instructive case for applying Plato's framework. The ghazal is saturated with emotional like longing, the grief, gum, and the pain of love, hijr. But Plato's moral charge, the ghazals would be precisely the kind of poetry that exercises and strengthens the irrational appetitive part of soul. Against Plato's epistemological charge, however, the Urdu tradition has its own sophisticated reply, one that anticipates Aristotle's response. Ghalib's poetry, for instance, encodes complex philosophical insights through the nature of desire, perception, and selfhood. Is this mere mimesis of appearance or genuine philosophical exploration conducted through matter? The question is not radical, as it is very important. Then Plato's theological charge is harder to apply to the Urdu tradition, which draws on Islamic theological norms rather than Homeric politism. The Masnavi tradition, Rumi's Masnavi, Ye Manavi, would likely satisfy Plato's requirement that poetry praises God and moral virtue, since the Masnavi explicitly serves as a vehicle of spiritual instruction. So this application is a pedagogical exercise. Plato did not write about Urdu poetry. The comparison is analytical tool for understanding his argument and scopes. You can apply it to different languages to understand how the Plato's concepts actually work. Now, Aristotle's response, Aristotle direct response to Plato is the best understood as systematic reply to Plato's three charge, though it does not always name Plato directly. On the epistemological charge, Aristotle argues that poetry is more philosophical than history because it represents what could or would happen rather than what merely did happen. Poetry thus gives access to the kind of knowledge that human possibility than Plato's framework ignore. On the emotional charge, Aristotle introduces catharsis. The experience of pity and fear in tragedy produces a purgation or clarification of these emotions, leaving the audience not more emotionally unstable but more emotionally balanced. So this is what he said about Plato. Aristotle's claim he is against Plato's arguments. So this response we'll look at a brief in when we'll be studying about Aristotle. Till now, it is this. So let's move forward. Section number 6, which is a center paradox. Plato, the poet philosopher. Plato's critique of poetry generates a paradox that scholars have debated for over 2 millennia. Plato himself wrote in a richly literary form. His dialogue employed drama, character, irony, myth, extended metaphor, and poetic prose of high artistic quality. His by Amav Bungier's formulation in his essay in the London Review of Books. He said about him, the most poetic of the philosophers. So Bungier carefully argues that Plato did not ban all poetry from the ideal city. Plato permits, this is permitted by Plato, hymns to the god and praises of good men. He said the gods there should be songs and in praise of gods, and there should be praise of good men too, as this shows the beauty of poetry. So only imitative poetry of certain kind was restricted, not all poetry. So this is what Plato is all about, that no, he did not dislike all sorts of poetry. Hymns to God and praises of good man, he allowed it. So the commonly stated claim that Plato banished the poet is an oversimplification. Simplification, the primary source do not fully support, as it is misconception about him. So Plato is famous for having banished poetry, but poets from the ideal city of the Republic. But he did no such thing. On the contrary, poetry, the right side of poetry, will be persuasive, presence in the society he described. So let's look at the kind of poetry he permitted and the kind of poetry he banned. So this is the type of poetry, Plato's verdict, reason, and these are sources. We'll be looking at these three. You can read it from here by pausing the video. The hymns to the god. Well, Plato permitted it. Reason is models correct theology, praises virtue. Then second type is praise of virtuous man. He permitted his post-moral formation of citizen. Imitation of virtuous characters. He permitted his saying this shapes good character through practice. Then the fourth one is Homer's depiction of gods quarreling. He banned his saying the false theology models civic disorder. Then heroes weeping, showing emotional excess, banned by him, saying corrupt characters strengthen irrational soul. Imitative comedy, banned, saying exercises the irrational appetite for laughter. Then the other one's last one, tragedy in general. He banned it, saying it nourishes and exercises the emotional part of the soul. So these first three are permitted by him, and the other four are not. So let's move forward and look at the key terms from Plato's critique. First one is mimesis. This is written in ancient Greek, this is also mimesis. Imitation or representation. In Plato's work, the concept is deployed ontologically. Imitative art is too removed from the form, which is true reality. Form is true reality, producing appearances rather than knowledge. So this term more narrowly to mean theatrical impersonation, the performance taking on character's voice and manners. Then eidos, which is form, eternal, unchanging, perfect archetype of which physical objects are imperfect copies. The forms are only genuine realities. In Plato's metaphysics, physical objects are becoming, not being. The theory of forms is metaphysical foundation of Plato's epistemological charge against poetry. Since physical objects are already inferior copies of form, an imitation of physical objects is doubly removed from truth. Then Baidia. The Greek concept of education and moral formation of the citizen, encompassing the cultivation of character, civic virtue, cultural identity. In classical Athens, the Homeric epics were the primary vehicle of idea, but Plato's critique of poetry is at core a critique of Homer's authority in Paedia philosophy, not poetry should be vehicle of education in the ideal city. Then let's move to Antheos, which is theomena, mania. Atheos means literally having a god within, divine possession or inspiration. Theomania is divine madness. In the Ion, Plato uses this concept to explain the poet's ability, not rational knowledge, but divine inspiration. So let's look at the fifth one, which is phantasma. Phantasma, appearance, phantom, or semblance, as opposed to genuine being. Plato uses this term in his works to describe the product of imitative arts, not a genuine likeness, but this accurately represents its original but a deceptive appearance, which seems real to the viewers. Then let's look at tripartite soul. Plato divides the soul into three parts. First one is rational, calculating. Second one is spiritual, spirited, honor-loving. And the third one is desire-driven. A just, well-ordered soul is one in which reason governs spirit and appetite. So these are the concepts from Plato's work, which are very important. So that is from where the references are taken for the work. These are the references. That's it for today. So the core crux of Plato's work is that this world is not real. The real world is outside, which is the true form, which is the real world, and the world we're living in is the copy of that real form. And the poetry is copy of that copy. As the poet take, for example, doctors in the poetry, the doctors in this world are copy of the real form. So when taking them in poetry, they're taking doctors as their features in the work, so they're a copy of the copy, which is imitation of imitation. As this world is not real, this is imitation of the real world, which is true form. So this is what Plato's work is about, and he distrusts poetry, not all sorts of poetry, some types of poetry. He allowed poetry which consists of hymns of God and praises of good man. So this is the whole topic about. I hope you understand it. So do like, subscribe and share, and do share your opinion in the comment section that what you think about Plato's opinion. That's it for today. You can watch the blog related to this topic and our website link is given in the description. That's it for today. Thank you. Have a good day.